800 miles of steel pipe carrying oil at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, suspended above ground that was never supposed to thaw. For nearly 50 years, that arrangement held. Now it isn't. The supports are moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but in a direction they were never designed to go. And the engineers watching them know that a pipeline built to outlast its own critics is confronting something its designers couldn't fully account for. The ground beneath it is changing faster than the cooling systems keeping it frozen were ever asked to handle. One support on the southern stretch tilted far enough that the repair crew classified it as an emergency on infrastructure that spent decades being called overbuilt. That word, overbuilt, is worth sitting with, because the Trans-Alaska Pipeline wasn't just over-engineered for the conditions of 1977. It was engineered around a specific assumption about the Arctic itself. That assumption is now in question. So the real story here isn't a failing pipeline, it's a brilliant design meeting a problem it was never designed to solve, and the question of whether the fix still has time to work. So start with what the pipeline actually is, physically, as an object in the world, because the scale of it matters before anything else does. 800 miles. That's roughly the distance from New York City to Chicago, except instead of a highway through settled country, this is piped through some of the most remote terrain on the continent: the Brooks Range, the Yukon River, the Alaska Range, tundra that goes weeks without seeing another human being. The oil that enters at Prudhoe Bay on the north slope comes out of the ground already hot, superheated by geothermal pressure deep in the reservoir. By the time it's pumped into the pipeline, it's sitting at around 145 degrees Fahrenheit, not warm, hot, the kind of temperature that causes genuine burns on contact. And here's the thing that makes the whole engineering problem snap into focus. When that oil arrives at the marine terminal in Valdez, 800 miles and several mountain ranges later, it is still warm enough to burn your hand. It has barely cooled. The insulation wrapping the pipe is that effective, which means 800 miles of frozen wilderness, and the oil inside never really experienced the cold at all, which immediately raises the question the original designers had to answer before they could sink a single support into the ground. If the oil stays that hot across the entire route, what does that heat do to the permafrost directly beneath it? And how do you build through frozen ground when your own product is warm enough to melt it? To answer that, you need to understand what permafrost actually is, because the name is misleading. It sounds like rock. It isn't. Permafrost is soil, gravel, and sediment that has stayed below freezing long enough for water to lock inside it as ice. In Alaska, that process took thousands of years. Some of the permafrost along the pipeline route is over 100,000 years old. It can extend hundreds of feet straight down, and the ice isn't coating the particles. It's threaded through them, filling the gaps, acting as the structural skeleton that holds the whole mass rigid. Remove the ice, and you don't have frozen ground anymore. You have wet sand. You have mud. You have nothing that can hold a pipe. That's the physical stakes in one sentence. Permafrost isn't frozen ground the way a frozen lake is frozen water. It's load-bearing ice disguised as soil. And when heat moves into it from the sun, from a warm building, from a pipeline full of oil running at nearly 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the ice melts in place, and the soil it was holding up loses its skeleton entirely. The ground doesn't just soften, it collapses inward. Engineers call it thermokarst. In severe cases, the surface can drop meters in a matter of months, not years, months. Which is exactly why the original designers knew, before they drove a single support stake, that 800 miles of hot pipe could turn the ground beneath it to slurry. The question was whether they could stop it. They couldn't bury it. Not through permafrost that hot oil would destroy. So they elevated it, and then they had a new problem. Every support stake they drove into the ground was now a conductor, a metal rod transferring heat from the warm pipe and the warm air down into soil they desperately needed to keep frozen. They had to refrigerate the ground beneath each support, continuously, for decades, without ever turning a machine on. The solution was a thermosyphon. Picture a sealed metal tube, roughly 2 inches across and 18 feet tall, driven vertically into the ground beside each support. The bottom section is buried in permafrost. The top section rises into the cold Alaskan air and is fitted with radiator fins. Inside the tube is a charge of ammonia, not liquid, not gas, but cycling between the two states depending on temperature. Here is the elegant part. In winter, the ground is warmer than the air above it. The ammonia at the buried end absorbs that ground heat and vaporizes. vapor rises. At the top, the Arctic air cools it back into liquid, and it falls again, carrying the heat up and radiating it away. The ground loses warmth. The permafrost stays frozen. The tube runs this cycle continuously, driven by nothing except the temperature difference between buried soil and open sky. No pump, no power line, no maintenance schedule, no moving parts. Roughly 120,000 thermosyphons installed across the entire elevated length of the pipeline, and every one of them is a completely passive refrigerator, running on Alaskan winter alone. The supports keep the ground frozen. The ground holds the supports rigid. It is a system that closes on itself. A passive system with no moving parts sounds, on paper, like it should last forever. But a thermosyphon can only remove heat that the surrounding environment is cold enough to pull away. It has no reserve, no override. It responds only to what the temperature outside gives it, which means there is exactly one condition under which the whole elegant design starts to fail. And that condition has been arriving, steadily, since the pipeline opened. The designers knew all of this. They weren't guessing. When the pipeline was engineered in the early 1970s, Alaska and its contractors had years of permafrost temperature data from the Alaskan interior, bore holes, soil surveys, seasonal readings going back decades. They ran the numbers. They knew how cold the ground was, how it cycled through the year, how much heat the oil would inject into the supports, and how much cold the thermosyphons would need to remove to keep up. Every calculation had a foundation, and that foundation was a baseline. The climate models used in 1977 assumed the permafrost temperature would stay within a ½ degree Celsius of its historical baseline for the pipeline's full design life. The spacing between supports, the diameter of each thermosyphon, the depth of every foundation pile, all of it was calibrated to that number. ½ degree was the margin of safety baked into the architecture at every level. It wasn't a rounding error. It was the load-bearing assumption. It hasn't held. What the thermometers in those boreholes have recorded across the following decades is a different story entirely, and it's one the original calculations had no answer for. The thermometers didn't lie. Boreholes drilled along the pipeline corridor, some of them monitored continuously since the late 1970s, show permafrost temperatures climbing in a pattern the original design team had no framework to anticipate. At Dead Horse, near Prudhoe Bay, ground temperatures that sat around -8 Celsius in 1977 have crept toward -5. At interior sites near Fairbanks, the shift is sharper still. Permafrost in parts of the Alaska interior has warmed by nearly 3 degrees Celsius since the pipeline opened. 3 degrees, against a global average surface warming of roughly ½ degree Celsius over the same period. That's 6 times the rate the rest of the planet has experienced. The ½ degree margin the engineers built into every support calculation, that assumption didn't erode slowly. It was gone within 2 decades, and the instruments kept moving past it. What the 1977 models predicted and what the boreholes now record aren't close. They aren't even in the same conversation. The gap between assumption and measured reality is the distance between a structure that was designed to last and a structure that is now being actively held together. But here's what that number doesn't tell you on its own. What does 3 degrees actually do to the ground itself, to the material the pipeline's weight is resting on? Right now, underfoot, 3 degrees doesn't sound like much until you understand what ice does at the margins. Permafrost isn't just frozen dirt. It's soil and rock held together by ice crystals, threading through every gap, every pore, every crack between grains. That ice is structural. It's carrying load. When the temperature climbs from -8 toward -5, nothing looks different on the surface. The ground doesn't announce itself, but the ice that was binding everything together begins to weaken, and the soil above it loses its skeleton. Engineers call what follows creep, not a collapse, not a sudden failure, but a slow, gravity-fed migration of material downhill. Millimeters per month, centimeters per year. Until you measure it, survey crews working the pipeline corridor began noticing it in the alignment data. Stakes they'd driven into reference positions had moved. Slopes that should have been static were inching. And then they found something that stopped the room. One section of pipe had shifted laterally by more than a foot from its original surveyed position. No earthquake, no flood event, no external force anyone could point to. Just the slow, persistent yield of ground that had stopped holding. The link was no longer theoretical. Rising temperatures in the boreholes documented physical displacement of steel above them. The same corridor, the same timeline. The pipeline wasn't just sitting on changing ground, it was moving with it. Which raised the question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. How do you fix a support that is sinking into ground that is still sinking? The question of how you fix a support sinking into ground that is still sinking has an engineering answer. But the answer depends entirely on one assumption holding: that the thermosyphons doing the cooling still have enough capacity to do their job. And that is precisely where the numbers get uncomfortable. A thermosyphon is not a general-purpose cooling device. It is sized, calculated, built to handle a specific heat load across a specific temperature differential between the ground and the winter air above it. The engineers who specified them in the 1970s ran those calculations against the coldest winters Alaska reliably produced, and the margins they built in looked generous. They had room to spare. What those calculations could not account for was a sustained shift in the baseline. When average winter temperatures rise by 2 or 3 degrees, the device does not fail catastrophically. It just works less hard. The temperature differential that drove refrigerant cycling up the pipe narrows. The heat it can pull from the ground per hour drops, and the margin that once looked enormous has quietly narrowed to almost nothing. Not broken, still cycling, still doing exactly what it was designed to do, but designed for a climate that no longer shows up. Which raises the question the engineers are now sitting with. What happens when the margin runs out entirely? When the winter is warm enough that the thermosyphon cools the ground less than the summer warms it, and the deficit compounds year after year with no recovery season left to balance the ledger. So the margin runs out. What then? The answer, it turns out, is already visible in the field, because in some stretches, the margin already has. Engineers did not wait for catastrophic failure. They watched the numbers narrow, and they moved. The first response was the least elegant: re-leveling crews. When a support tilts beyond its tolerance, you jack the pipe, shim the crossbeam, reset the angle, and walk away, hoping the ground holds this time. Dozens of supports along the pipeline's most vulnerable corridors have been through that cycle at least once. Some, more than once. Monitoring hardware went in alongside the labor, tilt meters bolted to crossbeams, temperature sensors driven into the permafrost at depth, data feeds running back to control rooms that can now watch a support move in something close to real time. The early warning system the original engineers never needed has become load-bearing infrastructure in its own right. But the intervention that marks a genuine threshold is this. In some locations, engineers have bolted active electric cooling units directly onto the supports, essentially adding a powered refrigerator to a system that was specifically designed to need no power at all. The thermosyphon was elegant, precisely because it ran on physics. These units run on electricity, and that shift, from passive to powered, raises a question the repair logs cannot answer on their own. How many more supports will need the same treatment? Because the answer to that question is also the answer to a much larger one about what this pipeline costs to keep standing. Every cooling unit bolted onto a support has a price tag. The labor to install it, the electrical infrastructure to power it, the monitoring contract to watch it. Multiply that across the corridors most at risk, and the repair ledger starts to look like a second pipeline, one that consumes money instead of moving oil. But here is where the arithmetic turns genuinely uncomfortable, because the costs are not the only number changing. The throughput is too. At its peak, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline moved 2 million barrels a day. Today it moves less than a quarter of that. And slower oil is not simply less oil, it is a different physical problem. Oil moving slowly through the pipe stays hotter longer, radiating more heat into the very supports the cooling units are fighting to keep frozen. The intervention and the decline are not separate issues. They are a feedback loop. Less throughput means more heat stress per support, which means more repairs, which means higher costs spread across a shrinking revenue base. Each barrel now carries a larger share of the maintenance burden than the barrel before it. That is the pressure that shapes every decision about how much to spend, and it raises a question that the engineers watching the tilt meters cannot answer from the field alone. If throughput keeps falling, at what point does the economics of keeping this pipeline frozen simply stop making sense? That question does not stay theoretical for long. The engineers who worked this pipeline have been answering a version of it, quietly, in technical reports filed with regulators and pipeline owners for years. And what those reports reveal is a profession grappling honestly with something most large infrastructure projects never have to face. The ground rules changed, and they changed mid-operation, with the pipes still full and the oil still moving. One report submitted to the pipeline's owners used a phrase that would have been unthinkable at the 1977 ribbon cutting: design basis exceedance, not a failure, not an emergency. Something more precise and, in its own way, more unsettling. The formal acknowledgement that the conditions this structure was designed to handle have been exceeded. The envelope the original engineers drew around every load calculation, every support spacing, every thermosyphon specification, that envelope no longer contains the world the pipeline actually lives in. That is not a finding from a critic or a regulator looking for problems. It is the engineering community's own language, applied to their own work, and it opens a question the industry is now genuinely wrestling with. If the original design basis has been exceeded, what does a new one look like? And can it be retrofitted onto 800 miles of infrastructure that was never meant to be redesigned in the field, one support at a time? That question, what does a new design basis look like, doesn't stop at the pipeline. It runs underneath every piece of built infrastructure in Alaska, literally. Roads buckle where the permafrost beneath them softens and the load-bearing layer subsides unevenly. Runways at remote airstrips develop waves and sinkholes that ground the small planes entire communities depend on for food and medical evacuation. Buildings tilt, foundations crack, utility lines sag between supports that have shifted out of alignment. The pipeline is the most visible example because it is the largest and the most monitored, but the failure mode is everywhere. And it is the same failure mode. Something engineered to sit on stable frozen ground is now sitting on ground that moves. In 2019, the village of Nuduk, Alaska began relocating its entire population, roughly 400 people, 9 miles across the tundra to higher ground. Not because of a flood, not because of a storm, because the permafrost under the village had thawed to the point where the ground itself could no longer be trusted to hold structures upright. Homes were sinking. The erosion rate was accelerating. The village wasn't slowly becoming uninhabitable, it already was. Alaska's permafrost underlies an area comparable in size to Western Europe. The question that follows from Nuduk, from the tilting pipeline supports, from every buckled runway, is not a small one. What does a future look like in which the ground itself is no longer a reliable building material across that entire area? The pipeline's problem is one node in a continent-scale infrastructure failure unfolding in slow motion. The engineers who built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 1977 gave it a design life of 30 years. It has already outlived that by nearly 2 decades. That fact sits quietly at the center of everything, because the ground it crosses has not stood still for a single year of those extra 19. There is no version of this story where the problem gets solved and the crews go home. The permafrost will not refreeze on any timescale that matters to the people responsible for keeping this structure upright. The thermosyphons will keep running. The support monitoring will keep running. The slope stabilization and the emergency response protocols and the seasonal inspection schedules will keep running. Because the alternative is not a gradual decline, but a failure event carrying 800,000 barrels a day across some of the most remote terrain on Earth. Which opens a question that nobody in engineering school has a clean answer to. What does a society owe to infrastructure it built on assumptions it has since invalidated? The pipeline was designed for a climate that no longer exists. The permafrost its designers counted on was a fixed condition. It wasn't. The obligation that follows from that miscalculation doesn't have a tidy resolution. It has a price tag, and that price keeps rising. The pipeline is not failing, but it is no longer passively standing either. At dozens of monitored supports, engineers have installed secondary coolant systems, active refrigeration loops that run year-round, burning electricity to hold ground frozen that used to freeze itself for free. The Alaska Pipeline Service Company inspects over 18,000 support structures on a rolling schedule, looking for the millimeter-scale tilts that precede something worse. That is the real answer to the question this film opened with. The pipeline survives because survival now requires constant mechanical intervention in a process that was once geological. The permafrost is not coming back. The engineering will not stop, and it will not end.